Resilience doesn't hinge on finding that perfect coping tool. It's about noticing when something isn't helpful and then giving yourself permission to try a new approach. Welcome to Oxygen for Educators. I'm one of your hosts, Michelle Kinder. It's our hope to bring you thought-provoking, unscripted conversations full of actionable ideas to fuel your important work in the world. Thanks for tuning in. This space is for you. Hi friends, this is Michelle Kinder, and welcome back to our series Radical Hope, Inner Work with a Ripple Effect. Today we're diving into something called coping flexibility. At its core, coping flexibility is that ability to pivot when stress hits, to notice if a strategy that used to work for you isn't working anymore, and then to give yourself lighthearted permission to try something else. In current circumstances, almost everyone I talk to is in a new relationship with their mental health. And part of what that looks like is being willing to consider what it is that's working for you in this moment at this time and lean in that direction and not hold on so tightly to something you assume should be good for you, should be working for you, that it almost gets weaponized against you, your attempt to find relief. When we think about the concept of flexibility, it seems funny to me that I would be trying to offer something to educators about that, because your lives, there's almost like a built-in imperative for flexibility. You know intuitively how to show up in flexible ways. How many times have you planned a lesson that you then audit in real time based on how it's landing with your students, and you zig left or you zig right? I think every one of us as parents can tell a story of something that worked brilliantly with our child one week, and then the next week it led to total mayhem, and so we had to make a shift. Educators understand flexibility. But what I want to highlight today is that it is not unusual for us to go blind to the need for flexibility when it comes to our own well-being and our own coping. When that rigid coping voice shows up, it could sound something like, just try harder, push through, this was the plan, stick to it, or there's something wrong with you, those sorts of inner critic messages. But there's also in us that flexible coping voice that might be saying something like, let's just take a beat and reassess. Maybe there's a different door here that will lead to a good outcome. And maybe it's even a door that might animate something in me that I've been missing or feeling disconnected from. You can probably tell in those two different voices, the rigid is constricting. It feels heavy. It feels judgy. And then the flexible is open, it's expansive, there's spaciousness in it, and it's even a little bit playful. Research shows that people who practice coping flexibility experience less anxiety, less depression, they bounce back faster from setbacks, and they can sustain hope in hard seasons, which makes so much sense when you think about it. If I believe that something I'm doing to cope should work for me forever, and then it stops working, my inclination will be to somehow create a story that makes that make sense. And often that's a story that is punishing and shaming to our own selves. If I believe that I'm in a constant dynamic relationship with my own coping, and that it's very normal for what works one day to not work the other day. And I've developed a robust menu of things I can try. Then instead of it being a cliff, mentally, emotionally, it's just a little bump in the road. Like everything we explore in this series, coping flexibility is not just about individual well-being. When you, as an educator or a caregiver, embody and model flexibility, the kids around you get to see it's safe to adjust. They get to see in real time that experimenting with how to buoy our own spirits and our own humanity is part of the human experience. And as they begin to do the same, the doors open wide for them if they have models in the adults around them. If they don't have models in the adults around them of what coping flexibility looks like, then, they're like in a dark room with a tiny little flashlight, and it's a much different experience. So let's double click and try to understand even more about this concept. Psychologists Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkmore talk about two broad categories of coping. The first is problem focused, and the second is emotion focused. So, problem focused coping is when we try to solve the stressor directly. So, that could be you like making a plan, or I don't know, asking for help, changing a routine, setting a boundary. You're looking at what's happening, and the way you're caring for yourself is to make a move. An example, your class is noisy, so you redesign the seating chart. Schedule's overwhelming, you block out time differently, things like that. The second category, however, is called emotion-focused coping. And that is when we work on regulating our response to the stressor. So it's not focused on what's happening to us, it's focused on how we're relating to what's happening to us. So that could be, meeting that moment with some deep breathing, some journaling, praying, going for a walk, changing your perspective, calling a friend, anything like that. An educator example might be that you're unlikely to be in a position to alter what's expected during state testing, but you can calm yourself and care for yourself in a way so the stress doesn't consume you. So we need the problem focused, we need the emotion focused, but it's important to know that most of us have like a default setting. And if I rely heavily on problem focused coping, but I'm facing things that are out of my control, I could be very overwhelmed very quickly. Same if I rely heavily on emotion-focused coping, but action is what's needed in that circumstance in order to lift some of the heaviness, then I could also be overwhelmed and frustrated and quite stuck. The research around coping flexibility I touched on already, but it's actually very encouraging. Psychologist George Bonanno and his team developed what they call the flexibility sequence, and it's 3 steps. The first is accurate appraisal, like the capacity to really notice what the situation calls for. The second is selection, so choosing a coping strategy that you think would fit. And then the third, and probably the most important, is monitoring and paying attention to whether it's working and adjusting if it's not. So people who could move through this sequence, especially the final step of monitoring and adjusting, consistently did better after loss, after trauma, after major stress. So the highlight underscore in this situation is that it wasn't they had like one magic strategy. That's not what mattered. It was the ability to assess, monitor, and then make a shift if something isn't working. That was the real difference maker. Another researcher, Cecilia Chang, found something similar. Across multiple studies, her team showed that coping flexibility itself was a better predictor of mental health than which specific strategy people used. People with higher flexibility had less depression and anxiety and more life satisfaction in her studies. So the point is this: resilience doesn't hinge on finding that perfect coping tool. It's about noticing when something isn't helpful and then giving yourself permission to try a new approach. This notion of coping flexibility also mirrors what polyvagal theory teaches us about the nervous system, which we've talked about in prior episodes. The goal isn't to avoid stress, but to develop the ability to move fluidly between states instead of getting stuck and kind of locked in fight, flight, or shutdown. In that yellow zone that we've talked about of sympathetic activation, of fight or flight, energy really surges. So we can feel anxious, restless, or reactive. And coping here, when that nervous system state is running the show, that sympathetic yellow zone fight or flight, coping often looks like pushing harder, trying to control the situation, or even escaping it. In that red zone, that dorsal shutdown, our energy collapses. We can feel numb, we can feel detached, we can feel hopeless. So when that nervous system state is in charge, our coping often looks like withdrawing or giving up or checking out. So just a reminder, none of these states are wrong. It's part of the human experience, and they are protective survival responses. But when we stay stuck, no matter what's ahead, we keep trying to push forward with the same approach, and it usually doesn't end very well. A flexible nervous system is different. It's the ability to slow down, look around, choose what makes sense. Mobilizing sympathetic energy might be what we need to rise to a challenge. We might need to bring energy into our system without a hijack, or we might need to drop into a more dorsal, immobilized state for rest. And we may be in a situation where we're capable of assessing, using a strategy, and then returning into that green ventral vagal, that state of safety and connection when the stress has passed. That's reflective of a flexible nervous system. Stressor comes, your body reacts either with that mobilized energy or that immobilized energy. And when the stressor passes, we go back into that green ventral vagal safe and connected space. However, many of us and many educators right now are stuck in fight, flight, or shutdown, and they're not getting that relief in their system, and it's very, very taxing. So when we're in that ventral vagal green zone, we feel safe enough to connect. We connect to ourselves better, to others, and we can be in the moment. Our breath steadies, our mind clears, our heart softens. It's from that ventral vagal safe and connected place that our coping menu almost automatically widens again. Um, we can think about problem solving. We can think about reaching out and who's there to support us, or reframing how we're looking at something. We can access rest. All of those things very naturally that can feel super opaque when we're in a survival state. They're very naturally illuminated when we move into that ventral vagal state. So, if y'all are up for it, let's do just a really quick check in together, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So, go ahead and take a slow breath and just notice your body right now. And just pay attention to if your energy feels like real amped up and kind of restless, like a little bit of that mobilized fight flight, or a lot of it. Or notice if you're feeling more collapsed and heavy, more like shutdown. Or right in this moment, you might be feeling really grounded and really connected in that green ventral vagal place. Importantly, those three states are really oversimplified. You might also notice you're in a bit of a blended state. Like when that yellow and green blend, it can feel like play. It's that safe and connected, mobilized energy. It can feel like play or just high engagement. When that ventral vagal green blends with the dorsal red shutdown, that can feel like prayer or meditation or deep rest. So just notice where you are right now. And if you find that you have more mobilized energy, you're more in that fight or flight, just see what happens if you let your shoulders drop and you exhale slowly, like you're fogging up a window. And if you're feeling more of that shut down, heavy, collapsed energy, see what happens if you just gently roll your shoulders and you kind of look around the room and try to take in more of what's around you contextually. It kind of reminds you that you're in a context, you're in a physical body that's in a room, and anything you can do around that can bring some energy into your system when you're feeling collapsed and shut down. And if you're already in a ventral or kind of pleasant blended state, then just take this moment to kind of savor that. Notice the ease in your breath or the softness in your gaze. Notice what's around you that might be contributing to that. So that very brief, just inner check is a way to strengthen the nervous system's version of coping flexibility. And when we get more aware of what state we're in, and we practice a tool that can shift our state even a little, we automatically expand what's possible. I also want to hearken back to our last episode about the inner critic and the inner mentor, because flexibility lives in the body and in the nervous system, but it also shows up in our inner dialogue. The inner critic often resists flexibility, saying things like, you should already know how to handle this. Changing course means you're weak. That inner critic voice pulls us further into rigidity. But when we connect with self with a capital S, that calm, compassionate center that we learned about from internal family systems, or with the inner mentor that Tara Moore describes, we might hear something different like, hey, pivoting is wisdom, and you are allowed to try a new way. You do not have to have it all figured out. A teacher once told me that she was aware that the way she was dealing with high chaos in her classroom was to overwork. So she was like, it's so chaotic. I'm just going to put in more hours. And she would stay in her classroom hours after her workday had officially ended. And I know many of you can relate. But eventually that led to extreme exhaustion. And she was even in some real risk. And when she began to track her inner critic, she realized she was kind of pummeling herself with the voice of, don't complain, just work harder. And as we worked together, she got better at tapping her inner mentor. And that inner mentor guided her to know that what she needed wasn't more hours in the day. It was more connection with her students. So she began starting each day with a 3-minute check-in circle. And that small shift reduced the chaos while protecting her boundaries. So that's a really concrete example of how she got better at knowing what was happening in her inner state and how that was affecting her, and how she can reach for different tools than what might automatically present themselves if she gets still enough to assess, monitor, and then shift if necessary. Another piece I want to cover today is that every nervous system is unique. So what works for one person may not work for you, and that is not a flaw. Sometimes we get swept up in popular coping strategies like meditation or high intensity exercise or journaling. And obviously, those can be wonderful, and there's research behind all of it, but they are not one size fits all. Your nervous system is like a fingerprint. So you've got to figure out what brings stillness and quiet to your system, or what brings energy into your system when you're feeling collapsed or shut down. Coping flexibility asks us to listen inward. What does my system need right now to feel grounded, balanced, and resourced? Not what's trendy, not what worked last week, but what is your body and your mind asking for today, or gosh, in the next 10 minutes? When we get reflective like that, sometimes the answer surprises us. Maybe you thought you needed to push through like that teacher, but perhaps what you really need is rest. Maybe you thought you needed to be alone, but you actually really crave company and connection. So I'll just reiterate, the point is not to find the perfect strategy, because eventually that strategy will let you down. The point is to keep listening, experimenting, and trusting the wisdom of your own system. So I want to go into 4 brief practices that you can use to build your coping flexibility. The first is an awareness pause. So in stress, it's easy to go on autopilot. So the awareness pause is just being intentional about asking yourself, is what I'm doing helping right now? I had a mentor who would phrase it, is this dimming you or brightening you? And I found that to be a really useful question. This pause interrupts the cycle and it just creates a little space. And maybe you begin to get clearer of hey, my anxiety instinct is to keep rereading this email, but turns out that is not helping me. My anxiety instinct is to keep grading even when I'm exhausted and can't keep my eyes open. But perhaps there's another way. So anytime we pause and get reflective about our inner world, it's an invitation for the inner critic to show up and derail us. So as you're doing the awareness pause, just pay attention to which inner voices are showing up. And if a judgy, harmful voice shows up, remember from the last episode, it's trying to protect you. And you can acknowledge it and thank it, and then give it a seat, not the driving seat, but a different seat on the bus. The second practice that I want to cover is a strategy swap. So this is that idea of paying attention to if you're working from a problem-solving lens when what you really need is soothing, or if you're trapped in soothing when what you really need is action. So if problem solving isn't working, perhaps you move into a more emotion-focused coping strategy like breathing or stepping outside, calling a colleague, things that might lower your inner temperature and clear your head to make way for problem solving. Now, on the other end, if you are someone who can get stuck in venting or stuck in an emotional spiral and trying to tend to that, you might swap it out for some small concrete action you can take and see how that impacts you. Maybe you draft the email or you set the boundary, you write that first sentence, something concrete that is more action oriented and more problem solving focused. The third practice is a coping list, essentially. When we're depleted, our creativity can shut down. So if we have a list of things that we can try before we're depleted, if the list is created before we're depleted, then we can just go to the list and, try something kind of almost the lightest lift possible. We're not having to drum up what we think might work. We've already done that thinking when we're in a green, calm, connected ventral vagal state. We've got our list. Then when we feel ourselves getting pulled into a survival state, we just go to the list and we try things until something gives us the relief or the action that we're looking for. People that I coach, I often ask them to identify their 5, know your 5. What are 5 lifelines that you can reach for when stress spikes? And, in honor of this episode, write them in pencil and be prepared or even eager to swap them out as you notice what works and what doesn't work. I have some things on my list of 5 that I'm super consistent about and have been for years. And being consistent with it is part of the medicine for me. An example, I think I've shared this before, but I run at least a mile every day, and I have since April of 2017. So over 3,000 days without missing. And the without missing is part of the medicine for me. So there could be some things in your coping bucket that you are rigid. I'm rigid about that. I don't negotiate with myself about whether or not I'm going to do that. On the other end of the spectrum, I have a pretty active meditation practice, but I run hot and cold with what feels helpful to me and what type of meditation I'm doing. And I feel very comfortable dropping something and picking something else up if what I've been doing is no longer serving, or I experience myself avoiding it or coming up with excuses or things like that. That would be a clue to you that it might be time for switching to something different from your coping list. The last practice is called opposite day experiment. And this is really playful, but also powerful. So basically, it just means that when you feel stuck, see what happens if you try the opposite of your instinct. So if you want to withdraw, see what happens if you actually reach out. If you want to push harder, see what happens if you rest. If you find yourself wanting to distract and kind of numb out, then perhaps you drop into stillness and actually take a real look at what you're doing. All right, so those are the 4 practices: the awareness pause, the strategy swap, and coping playlist or coping list, and then opposite day experiment. So as we're coming to a close, I do want to name this. Most everyone I know has experienced in the last few years some time when self-care got weaponized, either weaponized onto ourselves or weaponized by someone else. Perhaps you've heard, just take care of yourself, do yoga, drink more water, make time for you. So the message underneath it can often sound like, if you're still struggling, you must be doing something wrong. Or it might just feel like a complete mismatch of what you're dealing with compared to what's being suggested. Feels like like tone deaf. It doesn't land for you. So if you feel like that tape is going off in your head where you are berating yourself for not even getting self-care right, that is not self-care, and it's not coping flexibility. That's self-blame that is being sort of dressed up in wellness language. So when we think, if this coping strategy isn't working, there's something wrong with me, our nervous system tightens. So we get more rigid, more judgmental, less flexible. And then instead of pivoting, we double down on the belief that we are the problem. So no single coping strategy works every time. And we don't want to get locked into thinking we're the problem if it doesn't. What soothes us on Monday may not help on Thursday. What works for a colleague may not work for you. Flexibility voice is going to be saying something like, it's not me that's broken. This tool just isn't the right fit for me right now. And that shift from shame to curiosity is what keeps us open. It keeps us adaptive, and it leans in the direction of radical hope. So before we close, one more brief reflection. I'm going to invite you to just take a breath and think about a recent challenge, something big or small, something from this last week. And just notice the coping strategy that you used. And with curiosity and generosity of spirit, ask yourself if it helped or if it kept you stuck. And if it helped, celebrate that. If it didn't, imagine another option that you could try next time. And, keep that judgment voice in check and just be curious, like a dispassionate third person observer. So that simple practice, noticing and imagining alternatives, can really help us open up space around coping flexibility. So to close us out, coping flexibility isn't about having the perfect response. It's about staying open, curious, and willing to pivot. And it's not optional anymore. The ground beneath us is shifting at a rate of like every 30 minutes, and rigid strategies are just not going to hold us anymore. These times are asking each of us to get into a more active relationship with our own coping, to notice what's working, to release what isn't, and to be willing to pivot. It's not weakness when we do this. It's actually wisdom. And every time we practice it with compassion, we're not only sustaining ourselves, we're modeling for others what it looks like to stay human in these challenging times. So thanks a bunch for spending this time exploring coping flexibility with us. If this episode was helpful to you, please share it and let us hear from you. Our next episode is going to explore how attention shapes our experience and how we can get really intentional about noticing what we notice. And I will see you then. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Oxygen for Educators. Please like, share, and follow, and if inclined, leave us a 5-star review so that we can keep making content for you. Let us hear from you if you know someone we should interview or a topic we should cover.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guest and host and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any organization. The content is provided for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended as professional advice. Listeners are encouraged to use their own judgment and seek appropriate professional support when needed. Oxygen for Educators, its host, and production partners are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information shared in this podcast.